My thanks to the member for her fine speech and abstention of the motion. We now move on to our second round of paper speeches. Resuming the case for the proposition, we are joined by Mr. Jack Peters. Jack is a third-year human, social and political sciences student at Gonville and Caius College. He serves as chair of the Cambridge University Liberal Association and was the debates officer of the Cambridge Union in Easter 2025. He won the right to speak via open audition. Jack, you have the ears of the House.
Members of the Union, your eyes do not deceive you. I am not George Galloway, as was billed on the term card. Mr. Galloway sadly couldn't be here tonight. Apparently there was some confusion about time zones between Moscow and Cambridge. I can only apologise, but you'll have to put up with a Liberal Democrat instead. Now, to turn to the motion before us tonight, I want to begin by making my own life a bit harder for myself, by admitting that Tony Blair actually got quite a lot right during his time in Downing Street. The ending of Section 28, civil partnerships, the Freedom of Information Act, the transformation of the British international aid sector, intervention in Sierra Leone, peace in Northern Ireland, and that is hardly an exhaustive list. wait until what comes next. Yet I find myself on this side of the motion tonight. And that is because this is not a question of whether, as the sun set on Mr. Blair's premiership, whether his policies were net positive or negative. Rather, it is one of his enduring legacy on British politics. And that is a legacy of continually squandered opportunity. His relentless focus on short-term wins led him to will away his immense political capital rather than deliver on the truly necessary and modernising reforms. Public service improvements were delivered through capital expenditure, which masked untouched deficiencies, and Blair stood impotent as the housing bubble, as we've heard from up there, completely expanded. This left public services unfit for the demands of the 21st century and entrenched the interests of property owners at the expense of long-term growth. Now, Blair was elected in a historic landslide in 1997. I hope that is something we'd at least all know. But the economy he inherited was much rosier than what Rachel Reeves found in 2024, or even George Osborne in 2010. In fact, Mr. Blair's top economic advisor described Gordon Brown's inheritance as better than any chancellor in history. Inflation was at 2.6%, unemployment was falling, and economic growth for 20 quarters in a row. No wonder it was Ken Clarke to be the last chancellor to drink whilst delivering a budget. So how did Mr. Blair use this golden inheritance? Well, he invested very heavily in public services, and that he does deserve some genuine credit. But he failed to pair that with deep reform. Just think of how much more we could have got out of that investment. Lord Falconer, one of his leading allies, said that Blair himself deeply regretted his inability to move more quickly with reform of Britain's public services. Let me make a little bit of progress, but I'll take it in a minute. If we go to the NHS, we go for the guttural. Labour increased NHS spending by an average of 5.8% per year in real terms. Now, that is an extraordinary figure. But despite this, the NHS still lagged behind its OECD counterparts on healthcare outcomes, the ultimate metric that we should actually judge a healthcare service by. In 2001, the affordable mortality rate in this country stood at 121 per 100,000. That was one of the worst rates in Western Europe. Now, I'm not going to argue that Tony Blair suddenly destroyed the NHS. In fact, I think it probably marginally improved under him. But it could and should have been so much more. No politician until Boris Johnson in 2019 had such a mandate and such a majority to drive through a radical and reforming agenda. You know, political moments like 1997 are very, very rare, and we should absolutely see them maximised. And the inability of Blair to drive them reforms means that Britain is still one of the worst performing nations in Europe in terms of healthcare today. Now, the same story, an issue we've heard a lot of tonight, is of education. And as much as Blair did absolutely deliver a 48% real terms funding increase per pupil, which is deeply, deeply impressive, what did this actually achieve for educational outcomes? Again, outcomes are the metric we should be considering here, not just the money that is chucked in. Well, in international PISA league tables, Britain slipped from 7th to 23rd in maths performance from 2000 to 2006, from 8th to 16th in reading. all whilst truancy increased in state schools. More spending is a wonderful, wonderful thing, but it is not an end in itself. You know, the story of education, education, education is not a positive one. It is one where spending does not deliver the results that we want to see, that we need to see in this country. And if we consider the long-term consequences of the spending that we saw from Blair, in 1997, 40% of GDP was national debt. By 2010, that stood at 70%. Now, that increase has fueled a rise in debt interest repayments to the point at which they currently sit at double what we spend on in defence in this country and on long-term care. Money that could be funneled towards supporting the most vulnerable people in our society is instead being paid off as interest. Now, I briefly want to turn to two issues that I think are particularly important for young people in this country today, and what I would consider the most significant blocks on growth in our economy: housing and energy. Blair's government was completely and utterly impotent. It exacerbated the crisis that we find ourselves in today. Now, on housing, we heard a lot from housing up in the balcony about Attlee, which I would absolutely concur with. But the housing bubble, it boomed. It completely grew under Blair. There was an average real terms increase in property prices of 173% between 1997 and 2007. And in London, critically in London, where sort of the most important jobs that are driving growth in our economy, that figure was 253%. Meanwhile, average wages for young people, they went up by 19%. There is no amount of economic growth or public service improvements that can make up that difference, or nor prevent the widening of gap that we have seen since then between housing prices and median wages in this country. Now, on energy, Blair squandered the first 9 years of his premiership. Of his 10-year premiership, he spent 9 years blocking nuclear power. It was only in 2006 that he came round to the idea that nuclear was absolutely necessary to our green future. If you look at the current energy shocks we have faced, it is clear that the impotency of Blair to build nuclear, to support nuclear, has left us exceedingly vulnerable. And it has left us vulnerable on a green front too, because you cannot build a sustainable green economy. You cannot rely on sustainable green energy without the continuous and stable output of nuclear energy. That is a fact, and that is something that we absolutely, in this country right now, need to be pursuing. Now, this leads us to the question of why in all of these policy areas, in housing, in energy, on the NHS, on education, why did Blair not go bold enough? Why was the reform that he delivered not the necessary reform that was needed? And the answer lies in what I think is quite a profound issue, in that Blair institutionalized a mode of politics where style triumphs substance, to ring out the alumni debate we had here only a few weeks ago. Decisions were driven by short-term polling and focus groups. Politicians became these perfect caricatures of individuals, completely infallible. All this did was drive up our democratic deficit. People lost faith in politics, and Blair's inability to win them back helped fuel the rise of populism and widespread Euroscepticism, which has done, and looking at polls, will continue to do deep, deep, deep damage to this country. And there is nowhere that Blair betrayed public confidence more profoundly than on Iraq. He sold a war on the strength of what turned out to be a known fiction. In doing so, he shattered the bond of trust between government and the governed. The consequences of that choice went far beyond Baghdad. The belief that politicians lie, that truth is malleable, that Westminster will say anything to justify what has already been decided. All of that was born in 2003. And when it comes to the rest of Blair's foreign policy, I'm a Liberal Democrat. I naturally agree with him on issues like the EU, on issues like Europe. But being a progressive means taking people with you. And when it comes to these really critical issues, Blair was unable to do so, and he let the roots of populism grow completely and utterly unchecked. Now, over just 3 months in 2000, Ipsos polling showed there was a 12% swing towards people wanting to leave the EU. If you look at the vote share of UKIP, during Tony Blair's time in office in 1995, a couple of years before his election, UKIP in the European elections achieved 150,000 votes in the European elections. In 2004, they received 2,655,000. That is a failure, and it's a failure because Blair cancelled his manifesto commitment of a referendum on Europe only a year later. Now, tonight we find ourselves in the world's oldest free speech society, a society completely committed to the value of debates. You're sitting on these benches is an affirmation that we are better off for the open exchange of ideas. In cancelling that referendum, in not truly addressing people's concerns, Blair showed the danger of not having that open, honest conversation, of allowing views to fester unaddressed and be cast aside. And spoiler alert, it was not the prevailing of his view. Now, I must conclude. I'm sure many of us in this room were born under Blair, which is probably reason enough to support the proposition tonight. But in all seriousness, in '97, Blair found himself in uniquely favourable circumstances. He had an unprecedented majority, a golden economic inheritance. If any prime minister should have been able to drive forward serious reform, it should have been him. In any ways, Britain needed it to be him. But the politics of style and spin, of governing by the focus group and polls, killed the necessary modernisation of Britain's economy and public services. He did not go for the guttural, be it on housing, education reform, or levelling with people truthfully about Europe. Now, I stand before you, faced as an individual with the highest tax burden since the 1940s, crumbling, overstretched public services, no prospect of owning a house before the age of 40. Is it any wonder that people are turning away from the establishment? We saw it in the Brexit vote in 2016. We now see a dangerous Reform Party leading in the polls. And if you want to know how popular Blairism would be in Britain today, you just need to look at Keir Starmer's awful Tribute Act. Now, it may not be Tony Blair's fault that we had an inability to make use... It may not be Tony Blair's fault that we are in exactly the situation we are today. But Tony Blair came to power at a moment where we had a penalty. Britain had a penalty kick. It was a generational penalty kick. And Tony Blair, fundamentally, in kicking the ball so hard, missed the goal. And because of that, you have to decide the proposition tonight. Thank you.